Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my MSI 2024 Semifinals overview and analysis video. We are here. Top 3 teams are determined here at MSI. You have Gen G waiting in the finals for the winner of this series, the lower bracket finals, if you will, and I could not be more excited for this matchup. I do believe the 3 best teams at this tournament clearly got to the top 3, and that makes this matchup very exciting. I don't think either of these teams are unbeatable. We've seen that over the course of this tournament. Both of these teams have been exposed at some point or another, and so I'm very excited to see where they go from here. If you are excited as much as I am, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you think was going to happen in this series? Did it live up to your expectations? Always love hearing you guys' thoughts and opinions down there. If you want to know my thoughts on what I expected to happen, check out the playlist up in the iCard right now. In that playlist, every single day of MSI has been covered in play-ins, main stage, the primer before we even started the tournament. All of that's going to be in the playlist. If you want to see my preview of this series, you can check out yesterday's video. And if you want to see my analysis of the first time these two teams played off against each other, that's going to be in the playlist there as well. So go ahead and check that out if you are interested. But without further ado, let's jump into today's series. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in the semifinals, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game. And at the end of the series, I'll be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. At the end of the episode, we will be quickly previewing the finals. Depending on who ends up making it, it'll be a rematch of some sort, either a rematch of winners finals at this tournament or a rematch of the LCK finals domestically. Either way, it's going to be a really fun story and a really fun game to talk about, a really fun series to talk about, but most of today will be spent talking about the semifinals. So let's get right into it. I could not be more excited for this matchup. You see it up on the screen. It's a rematch of the round number 2 matchup that these two teams had. The number 1 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming taking on the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1. I really think these two teams match up very interestingly against each other. I think Bilibili on paper is just kind of better. Now, I'm not going to say everywhere, but certainly in a lot of different areas, you would expect BLG to be stronger. Knight is a player that I really put a lot of faith in, and I know he didn't have a great series against Gen G, but Chovy's just kind of on a different level from everybody else right now. I still trust Knight as easily the second best mid laner at this tournament, and I think that definitely carries over into this series, where when you look at T1, where have they faltered so far at this tournament? Well, Faker just quite frankly has not been Faker at this tournament. He has struggled way too much in lane for me to consider him like one of the GOATs right now. And, you know, a lot of wrist issues have been popping up over the past couple of years with Faker. I'm not going to try and say that I know what the situation is. I'm not going to try to explain why he's playing poor. This has just been a almost out of character bad tournament for him. This is maybe the worst tournament I've ever watched him at, and you know, he's still been relevant. He was really good in that Team Liquid series. There were a couple of games against G2 where I thought he was pretty solid, but just from a general overview perspective, it was kind of expected that he was going to be better than what he has been, and Knight needs to be able to capitalize on that. He simply has to be better than he was against Chovy in order for the series to be Bilibili favored. Also, you gotta look at the bot lane. This has been BLG's strategy basically every single series that they played against top teams around the world is dive bot, focus bot, get Elk super far ahead so that he can snowball the game out of control. If T1 has an answer to the bot dives, BLG has actually shown a lack of ability to, I guess, adapt over the course of this tournament. This was something they did really well in the regular season. This was something they did really well in the playoffs, but at least at this tournament, especially against Gen G, they just didn't really have an answer once that started to go wrong. I'm not saying they can't adapt, but I would love to see T1 at least force them to try and adapt. I think Elkanon need to be taken out of the game because Jun has kind of been a little bit of a liability. He was horrible against Gen G, and Owner honestly is in relatively good form at this tournament, which is to be expected. He plays better at internationals. There are still some concerns. I think Ben is definitely better than Zeus if you're a T1 fan, but I think T1 can definitely win this series if things go right. My prediction was Bilibili, I believe, in 4. That was my prediction in yesterday's video. I think my spread was BLG in 4, BLG in 5. I expect this to be a close series. I don't think T1's going to roll over and die, but on paper, there's really just no way for me not to say that BLG is the better team until proven otherwise. I need to see them lose to T1 before I think that T1 is more talented and better in a series like this than BLG. But come on, you can see the storyline. You can see the narrative here of T1 going on a lower lower bracket run just to get back to Gen G in the finals and potentially overcome their biggest rivals. That's definitely something that I think could definitely, the script writers are definitely kind of looking forward to that, but we could also be seeing a matchup between the two best teams in the world up until this point if Bilibili ends up winning. So I'm excited to see what ends up happening, but it's time to jump into the games themselves. Going game by game means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And they looked awesome here. This was a really, really fun back and forth game. T1 was actually in a really good spot, and, you know, Bilibili did a great job in the early game of pushing their aggressive tempo. The LPL just generally is going to have that advantage over the LCK. You know, currently, you know, we can talk about how historically that has also been the case, but it's even more so the case right now, where a lot of the top LPL teams are very aggressive in the early game. They like to snowball games, and basically all the top LCK teams are a little bit slower. Gen G, T1, they're definitely a bit more of on the, we want a front-to-back 5v5 team fight kind of ideology than the LPL is. And so for BLG, it's not surprising to see them come out and actually get some leads in the early game, mostly focused on like macro plays. Like Bin was able to get a couple of kills early. Knight was able to get a couple of kills early, even if the bot lane wasn't in a great spot, which is something we identified for T1, being able to focus bot lane and kind of take them out of the game. There was more than enough for BLG to be in a PowerPoint going into the mid game, I would say, overall. The problem is that T1 is so good at front-to-back team fighting that you actually ran into some problems here. Faker was doing a good job of actually just keeping himself alive in some of these fights, or at the very least trading 1-for-1 when we would have these 3v3s or these 4v4 skirmishes in the mid game. He was doing great there, and really the standout player to me was Keria, who was exceptional in the mid game here on the Nautilus. A couple of those engages were genuinely game-breaking. The problem was we got to T1 time, that 20 to 28 minutes that I always talk about on this channel, where they just kind of win every fight and just end the game. And they were losing fights, but BLG was actually beating them at their own game. And it was two players in particular, not that it wasn't everybody, but it was two players in particular who had unbelievably good games. Player of the game to me is going to go to On in the support position. This is like a generationally good Renata performance. There were a couple of plays where it was like legit just over as soon as On got into the fight, being able to buffer Tristana jumps with the handshake. It's a surprisingly difficult thing to do when there's so much going on in a team fight, when Faker is holding that jump and you want to use that handshake, you want to be useful to your team. It can be a little bit of a waiting game, a mind game to try and make sure that that Tristana can't get out. On won every single mind game, and obviously those ultimates, those hostile takeovers were really huge for BLG throughout the entirety of the game. That's why I think he was the most valuable player, but if you wanted to give this to Knight, he was exceptional on the Taliyah. Again, you can't let one of the best mid laners in the world have Taliyah right now. That champion is just too good. It's too strong. We've seen it over the course of this tournament. We definitely saw it over the course of the domestic playoffs, basically in every region. This is the best champion in the game, in my opinion, right now. Allowing Knight to have Taliyah, it just feels completely unfair. I get that you want to ban out things like Vi because of the consistency, Jax for Bin, but Knight is just too good to allow him to have a champion that is this strong, and he really dominated. He was landing those seismic shoves, and if you're landing the shove on Taliyah, it's game over. Like, that's literally the only, like, I don't want to say the only skill-intensive part of Taliyah, but everything else is pretty straightforward. You just have to land the shove. If you can do that, you're probably going to destroy the game, and that's exactly what Knight did. Knight and On, both with phenomenal performances. Some of the best individual games that we've seen from either of them at this tournament. I think Bin was also good. Bin has been very good across this whole tournament. He's probably been the best top laner at MSI, and I think that's definitely a pretty encouraging thing. We expected him to be able to beat Zeus. Zeus really struggles when he goes up against players that are as mechanically talented as him, because he does rely a lot on his mechanics. His macro isn't always ideal. You know, the Cassante was generally fine. I'm not going to criticize Zeus too much in this game, but Bin definitely more relevant. Jun was fine on the Xin Zhao. That's all he really needs to be. He just needs to be able to survive, which is not something he did against Gen G. And Elk kind of was a bit of an issue in the early game here, was constantly getting picked off, was positioning way too aggressively, but he became more relevant as the game continued to go along. You know, the team started to win around him, and he actually got a little bit more space in a couple of these fights, which generally helped him a lot. But Elk was definitely not the strength of this team this game, and they still were able to beat T1. And so I think that's a really encouraging sign. Knight and On look like they are going to dominate if they continue to play this way. I don't think T1's going to allow them to do that for the rest of the series, but it's really good to see them be able to do it in game one. And then for T1, Again, you had good moments here. There were a couple of 5v5, 4v4 fights that actually went in your favor. You were able to control the map. You had a gold lead going into 20 minutes. The problem was you just kind of lost it. You threw it away. And that's not the T1 that we've kind of grown to know. We've grown to know a T1 that goes into that late game with a gold deficit and ends up winning it back through their team fighting and their ability to front to back. And so to see them struggle so much with this comp, I think is definitely a bit disappointing. Dead of the game is going to go to Faker. He was really influential in the early game at generating that lead, but when they needed him the most in a lot of these fights with the R5 Taliyah, or the R5 Tristana into Taliyah, he team fought really poorly, was constantly getting caught out by either the Renata or the seismic shove coming in from Taliyah, and if you're getting buffered on your jump, like, it's over. Like, there's nothing else that that champion can do. Tristana is a pretty good counter to Taliyah, if only for the fact that you can pressure her out in lane. One of the few champions in the current meta that can actually do that in the early game, and Faker just didn't pilot it very well, in my opinion. I know the kills look good. He got a lot of them early. I think if he had been more clinical, surgical, better in the late game, I think they actually win this game. I do think that was the big difference maker. It's also worth noting that the Senna was just not relevant really at any point. The damage never really got there. I know teams really like Senna, and I definitely like Senna in the right circumstance. I'm definitely not on this, like, don't pick Senna train that Reddit seems to be on right now, but there has to be circumstances around the Senna in order to make that work. I just don't think this is the right comp, and specifically, this is not the right team to be playing Senna into. You're never really going to be able to get the stacks that you need, and you're not really ever going to be relevant. It's kind of what we saw from Guma, but like we said, Carrier was phenomenal in this game. He deserved to win the game. He just didn't because the rest of the team couldn't team fight. Owner was generally fine on the Sejuani. I think he did a good job of trying to set up around objectives, but again, he's Sej and he didn't have any carries. And Zeus was also fine on the Cassante. Maybe he was taken advantage of a little bit more in the top lane just because Twisted Fate's really annoying to have to play into, but I don't blame Zeus for that. This was just kind of a bad matchup for the Cassante in general. So for T1, you really relied upon a couple of members, your two carry duos, to step up, and neither of them really were relevant at all in the late game, and that means that you lost the team fights and you lost the game. You need to be able to recover. You gotta get your carries on something that are going to be a bit more comfortable for them. I don't think Tristan is the right pick right now. Get Faker on a mage, get him on something he can team fight on, that he knows that he can team fight on at a high level. I get that Azir and Orianna are banned out, you know, they banned out Corki and things like that, but there are way too many picks in Faker's champion pool for you to feel like you're comfortably taking that away. I would much rather see him on something that he's more comfortable on, rather than something with the playmaking tools of Trist, even if I think the champion is stronger, and get Guma on something he can win with, because that's been a win condition for T1 throughout this tournament. So they're now down 0-1. They basically got to win game 2. Reverse sweeping BLG is one of the hardest things that you could possibly be asked. If you don't win this game 2, you're in a really bad spot. But if BLG does win it, they're in a tremendous spot. That's going to be incredibly strong for them. They can kind of mess around with some of their drafts sometimes, and so it definitely is a nice cushion to have if you're Bilibili. But what's going to happen in game number 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and this was definitely a very good response from T1 after game 1 just kind of got out of their hands. They once again were able to generate a pretty large early game lead, this time even bigger, which I think is a really big testament to T1. This is not what we expected coming into the series. If you would have told me that T1 was going to be kind of the early game team in this series, I certainly would have thought they were going to run over Bilibili. That's kind of BLG's whole thing, is that they snowball games out of control. They use their mechanical ceiling to be able to make things a little bit more difficult to play from behind. We'll just say the 5v5s, they might not play super perfect in terms of their positioning, but they are so much better than everybody that they're able to get away with a lot of the things that they do. But T1's kind of on the level in terms of that, and if they're winning in the early game, if they're drafting a ridiculously aggressive comp like they are here, and you are gifting them a lot of early kills, then all of a sudden things do become a lot more difficult. Draven gets a triple kill down in a bot lane skirmish, and all of a sudden the game is kind of over because Gumayushi just ends up winning every single fight from that point onwards. Guma is going to get player of the game here in game 2. This should be no surprise to anybody who watched the game. He was terrific, and this is what we were talking about in game number 1. I think Senna's a super valuable pick, and I do think it works for T1. Remember, this was the team that pulled it out very consistently over the course of the LCK regular season, over the course of the playoffs. It's still in a really good state. I understand why they might want to go towards a more stable bot side. You want to scale into the late game, but right now, I just don't know if this is the time or the place for that. A lot of that is predicated on the idea that other lanes can win you the game, that Zeus and Faker are winning you the game in terms of their carry potential, and right now, that's just not really happening at this tournament. Faker has not been a carry so far at MSI. MSI, and Zeus is going into Bin. Like, you can't expect him to be able to win every fight for you because he has this gigantic lead going into the late game. It's just not consistent enough, and so Guma has to be able to step up and be a little bit more of a primary carry like he has been at times at this tournament, and that's exactly what he was here in Game 2. He has pretty clearly been T1's best player at MSI, and I think that that is a really encouraging sight for T1 fans. Regardless of what happens at this tournament, I think knowing that Guma can be a primary carry for one of the best teams in the world is it's really important information to have if Faker is going to continue to have wrist issues, which I'll just say now. But Guma was excellent on the Draven. I think T1 did a great job of facilitating that carry, and Owner in particular did a great job of making sure the Draven was in a good spot, even sometimes giving up their own lives just to get Draven trade kills, which I think is a really good idea. If you can get those cash outs on Draven, it doesn't really matter what else happens. Like, you're making way more gold in those exchanges, so it's almost always positive. And Guma's team fighting was exceptional. His ability to juggle axes in team fights is better than almost anybody that I've ever seen. He's clearly super practiced on the champ, and he was excellent in this game. But I do want to give a big shout out to Owner. Owner definitely deserves a bigger shout out at this tournament than I think he's receiving right now. I think there's been conversations about how, oh, it's kind of Guma and Keria versus the world. I kind of agree with that, but I think it's more Guma, Keria, and Owner in terms of how this tournament has played out. I think Owner has been really good as a facilitator, which is obviously what Owner, I think, was most known for domestically. That was something that he was definitely that was the role that he played. He was somebody who was going to play with his lanes early. He was kind of known as somebody who wanted to play a little bit more towards the solo laners, and that was kind of his ideology of how you wanted to win the early game ST1, or at least survive the early game ST1. But being able to play towards bot side, being able to play Sejuani about as well as anybody else in the world at this tournament, I think has really helped this team. His ability to be consistent in these games, I think, has increased a lot over the course of this tournament, and hopefully that's something that can stick. I'm not holding my breath for that. Again, I've talked about it with Owner. He's always going to be a relatively inconsistent player. It just always has been as a pro, but when he is on, when he's playing well, like, it looks really good, and he was really good in this game. Zeus was excellent in some of the fights in the late game. Again, you just need the Camille to be able to be relevant as this game continues to go along. If she can dive onto the backline and get on the Varus, get on the Kalista, get on the Nico, then you're feeling a lot better about your chances to win a lot of these fights, because you're taking out a substantial amount of pressure and damage from the enemy team, even if you are trading yourself at some points in time, and Zeus was really good in the fights, and so T1 just looking great. Faker was fine on the Akali. Don't really have any negatives. Again, Keria was good. The arrows could have been a bit better, but I thought his setup for the Draven was very solid. T1 just played this game very well. They were able to get a lead early, and they snowballed it into a win. That's exactly what you wanted to see from them. And then for BLG, losing in the early game is actually a bit concerning. I'm not going to freak out and say that they're doomed or anything, but I did not want to see this team struggle so much in the early game. I wanted to see them come out and generate leads, and if they were going to lose the game, just struggle in the team fighting stage. But right now, they're kind of not doing either. They were good team fighting in game number 1, obviously able to pull back that game, but this was a very bad game in terms of individual mechanics, and I think that that's definitely a bit concerning. Dead of the game for me is going to go to On. I think this could go to Elk as well. On's going to get it because he did sacrifice his life a lot more than he needed to. In a lot of these fights, it felt like he was just willing to be the martyr in situations where you just don't need to be the martyr. And of course, that does hurt your team, all things considered, but Elk's positioning was a big reason why On was feeling like he had to sacrifice himself in so many circumstances. He had to get himself in between Elk and the damage dealers. Elk is just playing really aggressive and doesn't really seem to have the same kind of poise that he was having earlier in the tournament. You know, I'm going to spoil it now. It's clear that Elk is very sick. I don't know how sick, but it was clear, you know, in game number 4 when they had to pause and he had to go throw up, that he is not feeling well right now, that something is going on with Elk. I hope it's not too detrimental to his current performance. I guess that makes one on each team here, but you know, definitely feels like that's playing a part in terms of his performance. He was not good in this game at all. His positioning was really poor, and the Varus wasn't doing enough damage to justify that pick, really in any context, especially after giving so much gold over to the Draven in the early game. I do want to give a shout out to Knight. It felt like a lot of those engages were actually super, in fact, impactful, I should say. He was getting 3, 4-man Nico ultimates super consistently. He just had no follow-up, no damage on this team, no ability to continue the chain once things started to go right. So fortunately for Knight, he continued to just kind of make a good play and nobody followed up. Jun was generally fine, but again, gave way too much gold and pressure over to the bottom side of the map in the early game, and Bin couldn't really do anything on the Cassante by the time we hit the end game. Just not a really clean game at all from BLG. Losing in the early game is genuinely concerning. If they do that again in game number 3, even if they are able to win, like, I don't know if that makes me feel better about this team. I need to see them come out and just have a dominant early game, a dominant pre-15 minutes. I need to see them just run over T1 in that stage, because that's what they should be doing. That's what this team has done all year long. For T1, if you can keep winning winning in the early game, you're in such a good position in this series. And so that's exactly what I want to see from them. It's going to be interesting either way, but game 3 now becomes, in my opinion, like I always say, the most important game in this series when you're tied up at 1 apiece. This best of 3 starts now, and winning this game number 3 is a really big key to success. So who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to do basically everything I asked them to do, which is win in the early game, and they're going to snowball this game out of control, and it was never really all that close. By far the least close game of the series, and that even includes game 2 where T1 did kind of destroy them. So really good stuff from BLG, a really dominant performance. The only bit of gold that they ever gave over to T1 was either super early on in the game, we're talking level 3 or something like that, with Nidalee diving the tier 2 in the top lane, or on just kind of like running into the fountain at the end of the game. That's basically the only bit of gold that they ever gave over to the enemy team. That's how dominating this performance was. For T1, get them out of the kitchen. Like, do not let them cook. He cannot cook. This is a crazy draft to pull out in game number 3. Like I talk about, this is probably the most important game of the entire series, and Faker is pulling out Zac mid for the first time in his entire career. This guy's played over a decade, and this is the first time he's ever played Zac on stage, and it's in game 3 of the MSI semifinals. Are you kidding me? You're playing Zac Nidalee as a mid jungle duo with the Yasuo in the top lane. Where is your damage? Like, how do you win this fight? How do you ever win this game? It feels impossible unless the Yasuo is crazy fed going into the late game, which I guess theoretically is possible. Gumayusi could potentially win some of the fights for this team, but like Zac Nidalee mid jungle, like we gotta figure this out, man. We gotta rein it in a little bit, because this was horrible. And we'll talk about BLG. I don't love their draft either. I think you're also lacking damage on BLG, but you have so much more lockdown, and you have so much more damage, even if you are lacking damage in a traditional sense, because the Annie is actually going to do a lot in this game, and we saw that. We'll get into it, but player of the game is going to go to Elk. I've been critical of how Elk has played in the first 2 games. I actually think he has been pretty poor in the first 2 games of this series, but game 3, he gets on the Senna, and he does prove why this champion is still highly prioritized. When you are able to get stacks in the early game, when you are able to have 50 stacks at 8 minutes or whatever, something ridiculous Elk had in this game, then you are able to just kind of dominate and run the game, and there's basically no one that can stop you. The ultimate by the end of the game was like 2-shotting Gumayusi. Like, it was literally doing 50% to the Kalista. It was actually absurd. There was no way that anybody was ever going to be able to survive the fight against the Senna. So credit to Elk. He needed to have his best game of the series here in game 3, and he absolutely did. I do think it was easier because On and Knight were really good in this game, and we'll get to Bin and Shun, who were also excellent in this game, but on the Ornn, very good ultimates, very good positioning. I think his ability to be essentially a third laner, a third solo laner for this team in this game was really influential in terms of creating map disadvantages for T1. Not that they really needed help in doing that. They themselves had horrible macro in this game, but On did a great job of pulling members away from fights and then just being able to teleport in and really create these big numbers advantages for BLG. And then Knight, what a perfect Annie game. Like, I'm not a fan of Annie as a champion. I think she's overvalued. I think she's been overvalued at the pro level for a little while. The champ just doesn't do enough damage, I think, to justify what she is. Like, she's like bad Syndra to me. And so maybe that's just my view on it. I think Annie's a little bit easier to execute, can fit into more comps than something like Syndra can, but you know, I've never been a big fan of Annie as a champion, but when you're holding your ultimate, when you are saving it and playing super patient in a lot of these front-to-back fights, waiting for the enemy backline to step up and feel like they're a lot safer, that's when you drop Tibbers, and that's when Tibbers can start taking over. Yeah, all of a sudden, Annie becomes a lot more valuable. Where Annie starts to lose value is when she's constantly on these big flank plays and is having to put herself in really dangerous positions in order to be relevant at all. Knight just didn't take any of those risks and still got all of the reward. This is essentially the perfect way to play this champion in the mid lane, and he dominated the Zac on it. It was a crazy win for Knight. We'll talk about the Zac, but crazy. Bin was very good here on the TF, mostly a supportive player. The damage was very good, and he was cleaning up a lot of the kills, but actually got a lot of resources from his team in the early game. That's what you want to see. Get Bin in a good position. Shun was very good on the Xin Zhao, keeping his team safe. He was kind of the peel in this game, which is weird to say, but very good stuff from BLG. They just played everything basically perfectly. Everyone on the team had their best game of the series, maybe with the exception of On, who was excellent in game number 1, but this was awesome from Bilibili. Truly a deserving win in game 3, but for T1, what are we doing? Like, I get it. Like, there are ideas in this comp that I think could work. I think Zac mid's not horrible. I don't think that there is like a it's not unplayable. Zac is actually a really interesting mid laner, if only because he does set up so much for the rest of your team. And if you do want to play for bot lane, if you want to play for jungle carry, like, I think Zac is a viable option in the same way that I think something like Sejuani mid is a viable option, right? You just want to get that set up somewhere. If you're getting it out of the mid lane, that's fine, but you have to have a carry somewhere else, and Kallista's not really this late game carry that's going to win you fights. Yasuo could get there, but he's got to get fed. He has to win lane here, and he just did not. Like, he was never given an opportunity to really ever be in a good spot. And then your jungler is Nidalee, who also scales really poorly. I just don't think you have a lot of synergy here. Maybe someone in the comments can explain to me the thought process of this a bit better, but I don't understand this draft. I think it's a lot of anti-synergy between these players, and I think that they played it really poorly. Guma's gonna get done of the game, was constantly being attacked by the Senna, completely outplayed by Elkanon, basically for the first time in this series. Kariev was 1-7-2. I think you could realistically give it to the Nautilus. He was hooking minions for a majority of this game. What are we doing? Faker had no idea how to play Zac, was constantly late on engages, was diving onto the backline with no follow-up. I get that perhaps maybe that's Zeus's fault for not actually doing anything, never pressing the R button in any of these fights, or, you know, Guma never pressing R and throwing Kariev into the, you know, backline or anything like that, but still, like, you can't just do that. Like, you gotta, it looks horrible. Like, we gotta admit, it doesn't look good. Owner gets that solo kill on the top side, diving tier 2, and then is probably the worst player in the game from that point onwards on the Nidalee. He was useless, accomplished literally nothing. T1 was just never in this game. They got destroyed. Their comp was bad. Their decision-making was bad. Their macro was bad. Their execution was bad. Bad game from T1, and it doesn't give me a lot of confidence moving into game number 4 now. They're on elimination point. Remember, the loser of the series is out. The winner of this goes to the finals. T1 now only has one more life. Like, they cannot lose another game. This is the last thing, the last life that they have at this tournament. So game 4 is a must win for them. BLG really want to close this out in 4, just like they did in the original series. We're on pace to get the same outcome that we got in round number 2, which is BLG winning in 4 after losing game number 2. I'm not saying that that's definitely going to happen, but they certainly generated a lot of confidence here. T1 moving back to blue side is definitely a positive for them, but they've got to get on something more comfortable. Again, that's what we talked about in game 1. Get to comfort. Let them play comfort. Don't do this. I need you to straighten it up. And then for BLG, again, win early game and you win the game. That really does feel like a pretty traditional strategy for this team, and I think that it will continue to be a major watching point throughout the rest of this series, or in this game number 4. But again, elimination point here for T1. They must win it. Will BLG be moving on to the finals in a repeat of their 4-game win earlier this tournament, or is T1 going to push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was T1. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to tie up the series, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. This is exactly what we wanted to see out of these two teams. We wanted to see them go head-to-head. We wanted to see both of them show up on the day, and both of them have. Bilibili was in a very intriguing position in this game. I think T1 was clearly better across the entirety of this game, but it wasn't a blowout quite like games 2 and 3 were, where it felt like, you know, game 2, T1 really got the lead early, and it never really felt close. They never really looked back. And then in game 3, it was very much like, oh, BLG is just running away with it. Game 4 was a lot more like game 1 in the sense that things were kind of even up until they just were not anymore. BLG was doing a good job of finding minor gains across the map, continuously picking off Zeus in side lanes, being able to try and get Gumayushi in bad situations. You know, Elk gets a solo kill on Zeus in the top lane. Elk outplays that dive later on as well. Like, there were really good moments from BLG, but the moment that this game headed into the mid game, all of a sudden, Viego, Aurelion Sol, Senna, this super slow, super teamfight-oriented comp, they just click and they go online. I've been critical of drafts like this over the course of this tournament because I think it offers so little pressure in the early game. You don't really have options when it comes to this comp. You have to wait for both A-Sol and for Senna to get online. You have to hope that Senna does get a lot of those stacks, that Senna is going to be super relevant in the late game, which is something that is not guaranteed at this tournament, but lucky for T1, it does end up paying off for them. In game 4, they hit these 5v5 stages, they are able to find a couple of picks, and Guma has 1 billion stacks, so he's doing 1 million damage. Faker is really strong, his mechanics are showing up. This might be the single best Faker game of the tournament, certainly up there in terms of his ability to dodge Corki rockets. I mean, You know, that play in the mid lane is absurd. And then player of the game is going to go to Owner on the Viego. This is what happens when Viego is played at a high level. I know Viego isn't very good right now. This champion has not performed well at this tournament. This is his first win at this tournament. But man, in the first win, it looked pretty darn good. The resets were coming through. His ability to team fight was super heavy. And honestly, he played a lot of the champions he was able to take over really well. He was a very good Nautilus. He was a very good Corki. And that's really kind of the difference, right? Is your ability to pilot those champions once you are able to get the kills. Like, getting those resets is big, but Viego's kit, inherently right now, the numbers are a little low, and so being able to pilot the other champions whose kits are better than Viego's, that's when things can start to get a little bit crazy, and Owner was very good in this game. We'll talk about it, but the jungle gap was pretty massive in terms of the ability to establish pressure in the mid game, and Xun has been the weakness for Bilibili over the course of this tournament. Owner taking advantage of that in game number 4. I do also want to shout out Faker, of course. Like I said, the mechanics were very clear in this game. We have talked about how Faker has looked a little slow at this tournament in terms of the plays that he has been making, the mechanics that he has been showing off, but he was awesome in this game. This felt like prime Faker in terms of his ability to play the Ace. Yes, he was caught out in some of these fights. They targeted him very heavily, and so his death count is a little bit higher than maybe you would expect, but he was in really good positions. His teleports were on point, and again, those micro movements were incredible. Just go watch that mid lane dodge of every single Corki rocket. He was dead to rights, and he dodged like 6 in a row. Truly unbelievable. If it wasn't Faker, if he wasn't on stage, I would have thought he was scripting. Like, it truly was that level of play from Faker. So congratulations to him. Guma finally showing what the LCK Senna looks like. This is what it looked like domestically for a lot of the year, where it was just like stack after stack after stack, and then you throw out an ultimate in the late game and it literally obliterates the entire team. We saw it out of Elk in game number 3. We saw it out of Guma here. Keria was good on the Ornn. Very interesting to see the adaptation that Senna plus Ornn is actually kind of the preferred bot lane for a lot of these teams now. I don't agree with that. I think Senna plus Nautilus is still probably the best bot lane that you can get, or Senna Tom. I still think Tom is in a really good spot. I don't know why teams have kind of moved away from him, but they like the more, I guess, playmaking aspect of Ornn rather than Tom, who's a lot more there for safety. I can understand the idea, especially in this comp. Zeus was horrible in the early game and then was really good in the late game. Pretty traditional Zeus game, all things considered, but T1 just across the board looking very good after 20 minutes. This was T1 time. This is what you wanted to see from them. This is a classic T1 win. But for Bilibili, why are you picking Corki? You're starting to test my patience a little bit. You look at T1 on the other side of this, you see Senna, you see Ornn, you see Viego, they draft the Aurelion Sol, and you say, you know what? We're gonna play really slow also. We're also just gonna pick a comp that doesn't really peak until the 5v5s. What are we doing here? Like, I just don't understand the idea behind it. Corki is a champion that I've complained about a lot. I thought Knight was really good in this game in terms of the damage he was able to output, but that champ can only do so much, and it's not going to be able to answer what Aurelion Sol and Senna can do in the late game, and so I really don't understand the idea behind that, and I think it was a really big problem in game number 4 here, but he wasn't the issue. Like, he was far from the problem in this game. He's still been excellent throughout this series. Dud of the game is going to go to Xun, and Xun continues to be, I hate to say it, but the weak link of this team at international tournaments. He is somebody who continuously gets exposed by the other best junglers in the world, and I'm not going to say I'm entirely surprised. He was not an A-graded, jungler for me going into the year. He did improve his stock, I would say, throughout the year, but he was not an all-pro for me in the LPL. Some people forget that. He was my 4th team all-pro, right? Like, he just missed the cut because I wanted to give it to Tian over Xun. This is not some, unbelievable player that definitely is going to dominate the entire world. Like, he still has a lot of weaknesses in his game, and they're being exploited by the best junglers at this tournament. And Owner was excellent. The mid-game pressure, like I said, the objective control was just so much better from T1 than it ever was from BLG, which is definitely disappointing. But On needed to be better. Elk certainly needed to be better in the late game. Elk did a really good job in the early game of absorbing pressure, like I talked about, but just couldn't transition that into something in the late game. So, that is something I'm going to be a bit critical. He did throw up in this game. They had to pause for him to go and be sick and then come back. So I'm going to cut him a bit of slack in that regard, but the late game team fighting was just not good enough, even after those awesome plays he made early on. In terms of his micro movements, Bin was generally fine, but the Twisted Fate definitely not nearly as useful when you have to play from behind. There are just some things that I think are a problem for BLG, but again, we're going into game 5 now. It's winner take all. The winner goes to the finals. The loser is out of the tournament, and my prediction of this really hasn't changed. My idea of where each team can win really hasn't changed. T1 has shown that if they can get to the team fight stage of the game, or if they can control the mid-game pressure, that they're going to win. If BLG wins the early game and is able to snowball the game out of control, they're probably going to win. The same things that we were saying at the beginning of the series still carry over into game number 5, but it is winner take all. It is do or die for both of these teams. Both of them expect to make finals. Both of them want to make finals. Only one of them can. Who's going to win it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to win this series, and they are moving on to the MSI Finals. We will not have a single regional matchup at MSI this year. This was the last opportunity. T1 was the last team with the potential to face off against one of their region mates at MSI, but nope, they couldn't quite get over BLG, and quite frankly, they had a really good position in this game. They just got gigabinned, and it happens. It happens every once in a while. Sometimes Bin just shows up and proves that he is the best top laner in the world, and this was one of the games where he did just that. I got a lot of flack, and I don't mean to, I try not to brag in these videos. I really try not to, like, go back to old takes or anything. I try to stick to my opinions on the game itself, but I got so much flack at the beginning of the year for saying that Bin was better than Zeus, for saying that Bin was the best top laner in the world before 2024 started, right after T1 had just won Worlds, and Zeus was Finals MVP. I'm sorry, Bin is the best top laner in the world. Like, the guy is just ridiculous, and he has proven that over the course of this tournament, that he is the best top laner in the world when it matters the most. There is just nothing that Bin can't do. His ability to teamfight is better than any top laner I've ever seen. Like, truly, his mid to late game is better than any top laner ever. I think that at some point is just going to become common knowledge with how he plays these games. He is a better carry than almost anybody I've ever seen in the role, at least in terms of consistency. You can rely on him to carry games like this, and when it matters the most, that's when he plays his best games. It is so fun to watch. He's player of the game. He's player of the series. He was excellent across all of the games in this series. I think if you wanted to give player of the series tonight, I think that's totally understandable. It should be one of the two solo laners for Bilibili. They were the most valuable players across this series for them, for sure. But I have to give it to Bin. Not only did he, I don't want to say single-handedly win Game 5, because it wasn't single-handedly. Everybody played well on the team. Elk had a great game. I thought On had a really good game. Knight hit a couple of really crucial ultimates. But Bin was the difference maker. Like, if you don't have Bin in this game, you probably don't win it. Like, that really was the game breaker, and he still was super solid on things like the Twisted Fate throughout a lot of the rest of this series, especially in their wins. To me, he was the most valuable player on Bilibili, and he deserves player of the series, but Knight also deserves a lot of credit. He's making back-to-back MSI Finals here. Remember, some people like to think that Knight hasn't accomplished much. He was MSI Finals MVP last year, and so we know he can win an international tournament. I get that JDG was a bit of a super team, but, I mean, Bilibili's a super team. T1's a super team. I don't know if it's necessarily fair to take away that accomplishment just because he got to play with Ruler. I think that, he is a big reason why Bilibili has been so good this year, and he was crazy consistent in this series. Even in their losses, he was definitely the best player in game number 2, where he was really valuable, and he was still pretty good in game number 4. He was definitely the best player on BLG in game number 4, even if he was playing Corki, a champion that I just don't think is all that strong. Knight and Bin, definitely the carries of this series, and you gotta give them credit. When Elkanon needed to step up, they did. The Senna Ornn looked ridiculously good between both teams in this series, especially in the back half of this series. Games 3, 4, and 5 were essentially decided by who got Senna because of their ability to fight. In the late game, those ultimates were shredding people. Elk was doing a great job of positioning. On was very good on the Ornn. This was a great series ender from them. And Shun, even if he wasn't perfect across this series, he was certainly good enough for them to be able to win. I'm still a bit concerned about him going into Canyon, who is just kind of the best jungler in the world right now. It's definitely something that we're going to have to continue to monitor, but they are going to have that opportunity because they are moving on to the finals to try and get their revenge. For T1, unfortunately, this is the end of their MSI run. This is where I expected them to kind of go out. I actually thought they'd do worse than this at the tournament. I thought Top Esports was a better team. That did not age incredibly well, but, T1 deserved to be here in the first place. Getting top 3, I think, is an accomplishment for a team that didn't even win their league this year, who never really felt like they had an opportunity to win their league this year. I know the finals were close, but that was really the only time it was ever close between them and Gen G was that final series. And so for T1 to still be a top 3 team in the world, even with all the things that are going wrong with them right now, like, that just shows the upside and the floor of this team, quite frankly. Dead of the game in game 5 is unfortunately going to go to Owner. We just saw him carry game 4 on Viego. Now we see him lose game 5 on Viego. It's definitely a bit of a double-edged sword when you're getting Hextech ultimatumed in every single fight. You can't really get your resets. You're just getting 1v1 by the Camille, and all of a sudden the game is over. Bin certainly got his target locked on Bin, or on Owner, I should say, the entirety of this game, and it was definitely unfortunate for the Viego, but really not much you can do about it. You just lost a lot of the 1v1s, which is, it is what it is. I think Gumayushi was worse in this game than people are going to give him credit for. I know he was in a bad situation, but he also just was way too far forward in a lot of positions where he needed to be safer. Carry it, very similar, just playing way too aggro. I know that you had a gold lead for parts of this game, but a lot of that was on Zeus and on Owner. Like, you needed to play around them. Faker was playing excellently in the early game, and it just didn't really matter because they were giving away gold for free, essentially, in the mid game, especially after fights ended up going poorly. Guma getting caught under tier 1 tower by 4 members, like, you have to play safer than that. I'm sorry. You have to give up the tower. That is your fault that you died there. So I don't know, not a great game from them. Faker was good. I honestly think he got better as this series went along, which is a super encouraging sign. It's just unfortunate that it wasn't enough. He certainly wasn't the kind of carry that you would expect on Talia. Certainly not what we saw out of Knight in game number 1. And then Zeus was generally fine, but completely outclassed and outplayed by his opponent on the other side. And I would say that was true across a majority of this series. There were a couple of games where Zeus was awesome, but I would say especially for a majority of the games, Bin was definitely the better top laner, and we definitely saw that here in game number 5. Again, I don't want to be too critical of T1. Them getting here, I think, is exactly where they wanted to be. This did not need to be a finals team. They did not win the LCK. The expectation was not that they were going to make top 2, and so for them to get top 3, I think is a relatively okay accomplishment for them. I know T1 fans are probably going to be a bit upset by that because they were supposed to win everything, but I think this is a realistically good outcome for them. But for BLG, they now have the opportunity to get their revenge. Knight has the opportunity to get his revenge on Chovy, who outplayed him in that first series. You know, Bin has his opportunity to get revenge on Keen, who was excellent. Elk and On have their opportunity to show that they can still win even if they are getting pressured in the early game. Shun definitely needs to get his revenge against Canyon for what happened in the previous series. There's a lot to like about this matchup, and it's the number 1 seed from the 2 best regions in the world. What else is there to celebrate? This is going to be a fun one, and I, for one, cannot wait to see what happens. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI semifinals overview and analysis video. 2 teams remain. The number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen G, the number 1 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming. This is the dream matchup. This is what we all wanted to see in the MSI finals. We wanted to see the 2 best from the 2 best regions go head-to-head, and that is what we're getting. We already saw this, obviously, Gen G taking the 3-1 win in winners finals, but BLG, I think, played a little bit below their standards in that series, and we saw what they could do in that game number 1, where they controlled the early game and were just able to snowball out of control. We know BLG can win games against Gen G. The question is, can they do that across an entire series? That is definitely something we are going to have to see, but one of Chovy or Knight will be winning MSI this year. One of Canyon or Shun will be winning MSI this year. One of Elk or Pays will be winning MSI this year. I'm very excited for all these players, and I'm very excited for this matchup. Who do I think is going to win? Well, it's hard to not predict Gen G after that previous performance, but I would be shocked if it was as bad as it was in the winners finals. Again, I think BLG performed under their expectations. I think they performed under their skill level, and I expect that to not happen in the finals. If Shun continues to get completely canyoned by Canyon himself, then yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit difficult for them to win this series. But if Shun can show up, if he can survive, if they especially have an answer to the enemy team just diving bot over and over again and countering your own strategy of winning through bot, if you can win through Bin, if you can win through Knight, which you absolutely can do, you did it in this series, you've done it all year long. If you prioritize those sides of the map, I think Bilibili's definitely going to make it more of a challenge than it was in the winners finals. I'm still going to predict Gen G because they are just the best team in the world until proven otherwise, but I'm going to predict Gen G in 5. My spread is Gen G in 5, BLG in 5. I think this is closer to being a banger series or one that I could see BLG winning than what I would expect winners finals to happen again. Like, I don't expect winners finals to happen again. That's essentially what I'm trying to say. If it does, credit to Gen G. They really are that damn good, but I think Bilibili is going to be more prepared and more ready for Gen G this time, and I certainly hope so. I want a banger of an MSI Finals because this tournament has been awesome. This has been one of the best international tournaments we've gotten in a long time, and I'm really excited to say that. So let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to win in the finals? Do you think it'll be Gen G? Do you think it'll be BLG? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. You know, MSI is almost over, but the summer split's just around the corner for all of the major regions. We, of course, cover all of the major regions on this channel. So if you're interested in that, hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all